Evening. I like response. Good evening. There we go. Get good energy going. I first want to send regrets on behalf of President Huron. He is traveling and unable to be here. I'm sad that he's not, but that means I get the privilege of introducing tonight. I am Sarah Kirk. I'm the Provost and Dean of Faculty, and I'm very, very excited to be able to share with you this event as we kick off our first inaugural Anderton Economic Policy Symposium. This forum provides us with an opportunity to annually host an expert in the field of economics so that they can share their experience and insight with both our campus and the broader community. Both this symposium, as well as the Anderton Forum for Global Engagement, for which we hosted former Ukrainian Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch last March, are made possible by Dr. Jim Anderton, a Hobart alum from the class of 1965. He served on the board as a trustee from 1994 to 2000 and is the founder and executive chairman of Crimson, a property management and real estate investment and development company. While at HWS, Dr. Anderton majored in economics. He is a longtime supporter of the colleges and has made generous gifts to the colleges, including the Anderton Impact Challenge for scholarship and financial aid and the Anderton 50th Reunion Cup to inspire giving among the 50th reunion classes in a spirit of friendly competition. As you can see from his generosity, he not only provides opportunities such as this, but also inspires alums and friends to commit to the future and vitality of Hobart and William Smith colleges. He was awarded the Hobart Medal of Excellence, the Hobart Alumni Association's highest honor, in 1997. In 2015, he received the Lifetime Service Award, which is presented to an alum who has made exceptional lifelong contributions to Hobart College. We are eternally grateful to Dr. Anderton for his commitment to the colleges. And this evening, we especially appreciate his desire to foster vital and lively conversations in our classrooms, within our campus forums, and throughout our community. I would like to now introduce Dr. Faisal Khan, Professor of Economics, to introduce tonight's distinguished guest.
Oh, thank you, sir. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our first Anderton Economics, first Anderton Economics Symposium. Thank you for taking time out on your schedule to be here this evening. I'd also like to thank our trustee, Jim Anderton, for his extreme generosity in endowing two speaker series. I thought I would actually, warm up the crowd a bit by making a few of my famous econ jokes. I can see a few of my students there think, oh, please. But I was told that don't do that. You will drive them all out because they've had a chance to hear our speaker. So, okay, no econ jokes. If Aiden is out there, I don't care what you say. My jokes are fine. But okay. All right. So our speaker this evening is Professor Narayana Kochalakota, the Lionel W. Mackenzie Professor of Economics at University of Rochester, and a very preeminent monetary policy expert. I could go on at length about his many scholarly publications, the journals he published in, the AER, the Journal of Geopolitical Economy, et cetera, but that may not mean much to you, to most of you in the audience, or the fact that his work has been cited literally thousands of times. But frankly, you can Google all that anyway. Take my word for it, Professor Kochalakota is a highly respected economist. Now, there are actually quite a few such economists out there, so why would we invite him? Well, he was also, from 2009 to 2015, the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. And in that position, he served on the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the interest rate setting arm of the Fed. And so he's been in the policy-making trenches during some, shall we say, interesting economic times, right at the end of the day, trying to get out of that. And excuse me. Now, again, there are quite a few people who serve on the FOMC. So why him in particular? Well, there are very few people who are both highly qualified, who are highly qualified economists and who have served at the highest economic policy making level. Now we're talking about scarcity indeed. Okay, I lied. One small number. All right. Okay. Now, to be a successful central banker requires not just mastery of economics, being extremely comfortable with the data and the ability to remain calm during, trying economic times, but it also really recognizes two things. It needs a certain ruthless pragmatism because you have to be willing to go where the data leads you. You have to be willing to try what works because things have to work not just in theory but in practice. The stakes are just too high otherwise. And all that and more is why we think, Professor Lakota would be the perfect, kickoff speaker for our economic series. Now, I will stop going on and on at length and say that you're not here to hear me or the rest of the but you're here to hear Professor Lakota. So without further ado, please.
Thanks a lot, Faisal, and thanks, Sarah, and thanks to Dr. Anderton. I mean, it's fantastic to have these kinds of events on college campuses, have external speakers come and be able to share what their experiences with students and the faculty. It's great. It's really fantastic to have donors who appreciate it. So I'm going to talk about a tale of two economic recoveries. And Professor already alluded to my background, and the way I come to this topic is that, so from 1987 to 2009, I was an economics professor at Baltimore schools. And then from 2016 onwards, I've been an economics professor again at the University of Rochester. And so that's basically about doing research and teaching economics to students. In between, from 2009 to 2015, I was the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. Now, that job comes with a lot of responsibilities, as it turns out. But I'm going to focus. But what's most relevant for our conversation today is that I served on the Federal Open Market Committee, which, as Faisal alluded to, it's the monetary policy making arm of the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve is the U.S. central bank. You can go on at length about the U.S. central bank. It's a very unusual structure. It's very decentralized, but it happens to have an office in Minneapolis, and that's where I was located. That's where I served. So I'm going to come to this question. I'm going to come to my talk from really both of those perspectives, both as an academic and as a policymaker. I'm going to come to this topic from both directions. So we had two recessions in the U.S. in the past, it's now 16 years or so. And one was from December 2007 to June 2009. This is often called the Great Recession, and largely because of its length. And at the time, it seemed like the unemployment rate had gotten very high. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then from February to April of 2020, there was another recession, and that was associated with the onset of COVID. The first recovery from the Great Recession was very slow. Arguably, it was really never complete. And the second recovery was still a work in progress, and we'll talk about, since it is a work in progress, which is not, was extraordinarily fast. So what can we learn from these two observations? And the main point I'm going to try to make today is that faster recovery that we experienced from the COVID recession was due in large part to policy, macroeconomic policy. We had much more aggressive monetary and fiscal policy in the wake of COVID than we did in the meeting and in the wake of the Great Recession. That more aggressive response is what has facilitated the much stronger recovery from the latter recession. That's going to be the main theme of my talk. as you know, as we're going to have lots of time for questions, and that is my favorite part of these talks because I sort of know what I'm going to say, mostly, and so what I'm really looking forward to is hearing what you have to say, and your questions I think will end up stimulating a more interesting conversation than my going through my slides. So I look forward to that. All right. So what am I going to do? I'm going to talk about the data first. I'm going to lay out what we have in mind here when we talk about recessions and recoveries. And I'm going to talk about macroeconomic policy. I'm going to talk about the instruments of what macroeconomic policy is and the goals. And then I'll talk about how policy worked in the post-2009 recovery, which, as I argued earlier, or suggested earlier, was not much of recovery. And then I'll talk about macro policy in the current recovery. And I have my theme that I'm pushing on you, and which is that the second policy approach was a superior one, but really there's a strong sense in which it's too soon to tell. And I'll be honest about that again, that we still have yet to learn, which I think there are events that are going to unfold still that will teach us which approach is better. The data. So I'm going to look at three measures of aggregate economic performance. Two of them are what we call real, they're quantity oriented, and the last is price oriented, which is about inflation. And so the first measure I'll look at is per capita real gross domestic product. And what does that mean? That refers to the amount of production that's going on in the United States per person. So it's an attempt to measure how many goods and services are being produced. Why do we see real? Well, it's a tricky thing to add up across all these goods and services. They all have different prices. And one of the things we're going to try to correct for is the fact that the amount of output might be growing simply because the prices of everything is growing. We don't want to capture that. We want to try to capture quantities. And so that is what real does. It tries to get rid of the price growth part and focus on the quantity growth part. And per capita simply means I'm going to divide by people. I want to know per person how much of the. Okay. So I'll come back and talk about unemployment rate and inflation momentarily. So this is what real gross domestic product per capita look like in the United States. This graph is from 2007 quarter one, and the Great Recession starts in 2007 quarter four. It starts in December of 2007. Although, if you're watching the data pretty closely, even by 2007 quarter one, you're starting to see things are not going so well. But we'll go with the dating is 2007 quarter four, and the way you can see that is these gray shaded areas represent recession. This is another recession. This is the COVID recession. Look how thin it is compared to this one. This is 18 months. This is 2 months. And that's why this is called the Great Recession. This is not called the Great Recession. So here's the real gross domestic product per capita right at the beginning of the Great Recession. It's about $56,000. Of course, that number doesn't matter at all. What matters is I'm going to draw this red line and see how long it takes me to get back to that red line. And the answer is it takes us about 4 years to get back to where we were. And I'm going to do the same thing for COVID. So COVID, we all remember, we were just talking about walking over. It hits in the first quarter of 2020. So I'm going to look at the fourth quarter of 19. I'll look at real gross domestic product there, draw a line like that. And hey, I'm back to that line much faster, something on the order of about a year. So that's one way we can say that the recovery is much faster from COVID than it was from the Great Recession. The amount of output being produced per person is gets back to what it was before the event much more rapidly in COVID than it does in the Great Recession. Okay, so that's one data point telling us that this recovery was more rapid. And this is just repeating what I just told you. And here I'm the beginning of the Great Recession, which I highlighted earlier, was in December of 2007. The end of the Great Recession is June of 2009. You might wonder, how is this determined? Well, we have a very unusual system for this in the United States. We have a group of economists, they're private sector economists. They are associated with an organization called the National Bureau of Economic Research, which sounds like it should be a government organization, but it's not. And they get to decide, are we in a recession or not? And sometimes they'll tell you like a year later, oh, we were in a recession back then. Well, that's how it works in the United States. So I don't think as I'm suggesting, it's not necessarily a perfect system, but that's the way we do it. Recovery 2, which is after April of 2020. So the recession is dated as February to April of 2020, the COVID recession. And as I suggested earlier, per capita real GDP takes only about a year after the recovery begins to get back to the recession. So when I said 4 years, I probably was a little misleading. When I said 4 years, I'm really talking about after June of 2009, when the recession ended, not from the beginning. All right, so now let me talk about unemployment. And when I'm going to talk about monetary policy and the Federal Reserve, actually, the Fed doesn't pay a ton of attention to per capita real GDP because it's affected by too many things other than monetary policy. They focus on two variables. One of them is the unemployment rate. And we'll see why they focus so much on the unemployment rate in a few minutes. But take it from me now. For now, this is one of the variables they pay a lot of attention. So what is the unemployment rate? It's in a basically we go out, the Bureau of Labor Statistics go out and surveys households and ask them two questions. First question is, are you working? If you are working, you're counted as employed. If you're not working, they ask you a follow-up question. Have you looked for work in the past 4 weeks? If you've looked for work in the past 4 weeks, keep that number in mind. It's short. If you looked for work in the past 4 weeks, you're counted as unemployed. And then unemployment rate is the unemployed divided by the sum of the employed and the unemployed. So it's not the same as non-employed. Non-employed is going to include a lot of retired folks. They're not looking for work. We don't view the fact that they're not working as a huge social problem. They've worked hard their whole lives. Now they're playing golf, whatever they do. That's all fine. What we're worried about, what we're trying to capture as a social problem is we've got people who are willing to work, want to work, but are not able to find a job. That is a social problem. And that's what the unemployment rate is. So here's the Great Recession. Unemployment rate spikes from 5% to 10%, and then it comes back down. One of my, Tesla was asking me what I feel frustrated about sometimes when I listen to the media. One of the things I felt frustrated about is you'll often hear this described as a great time because it was a very long recovery period. We were in recovery this whole time. Being in recovery this whole time means unemployment is very high for much of this time. So that's actually not such a great thing. So you see how long it takes us to get back to, and I misspoke again, I'm sorry. This is 4.5%, this red line. I've chosen a little arbitrarily to mark good times in terms of the labor market. If unemployment is as low as 4.5%, that's typically been viewed as a pretty strong labor market. Here's COVID. Unemployment rate gets up to 14.5%, but it comes down super fast. And in fact, post June 2009, it takes unemployment 8 years to get back to 4.5%. So all throughout that time, there are people who are unemployed, who are not working, but would like to work. And we're losing their output. We're losing their ability to produce in the United States. That's what you want to be thinking about. And it's harmful for them as well. There's tons of harm associated with being in this state of wanting to work, but not being able to find work. Recovery 2, the unemployment rate takes about 1.5 years to come back to 4.5%. So it's very rapid. Yeah, one of the things that we do as economists is that we're very good at taking deep social problems and converting them to relatively bloodless statistics. But you never want to forget the deep social problems that are underlying the statistics, the number. And unemployment is just one of these numbers that we throw around and say, oh, it's 10%, 8%, 5%, whatever. But that represents an enormous, If it's 10 instead of 5, it represents an enormous amount of social human misery. And loss production for the economy as well. Okay, so now I've talked about two quantity-oriented variables. One is real gross domestic product per person, and the other is the unemployment rate. The next variable I'm going to look at is related to what's called inflation. This is an attempt to measure the rate of increase of prices from one year to the next. Now, what's hard here is if you only had one good, if you only had apples, it'd be easy to figure out the rate of inflation. We just look at how much apples cost last year, see how much it grew, that's your rate of inflation. The U.S. economy has many more goods and services besides just one. And so you have to find a way to average across those. Take it from me, people have thought about this a lot, and that's they've got a good way to average across all these goods and services. And that's embedded in what I'm saying. All right, so this is inflation before the Great Recession, a little above 2%. Now, why have I drawn a red line at 2%? That turns out to be where the Federal Reserve likes inflation to be. We'll talk a little bit about why they want it there, but that's where they're aiming to keep inflation. They were pretty bad at that after the Great Recession, in the sense that inflation, and by they, I mean me as well, because I was part of the problem for this period, that inflation stayed well below 2% throughout this time frame. Now, as you probably heard, inflation shot up in beginning in early 21 and has been high ever since relative to this 2% target. It's been coming down, and that's important to keep in mind, but it remains high relative to this 2% target. So the Fed's target is 2%, as I mentioned earlier. The inflation rate stayed below 2% through 2019. So it basically really never got back up to target the whole time after the Great Recession. That's a sense in which I think the recovery was never. Now, of course, we have this inflation rate rose above 2% in March of 21 and has been above 2% ever since. It's what now 2.5 years. All right, so those are our three data points. We're going to look at the two recoveries along these three data points. Real GDP recovers much faster after COVID. The unemployment rate recovers much faster over COVID. And inflation, now, and we'll talk, it's not clear if it's a good thing or a bad thing. We'll have to talk a little bit about that. But inflation never got back to 2% after the Great Recession. But after COVID, it's gotten above 2% and now has stayed above 2% for 2.5 years. One quick side point, which is only a side point. These numbers are going to look a little different from what you normally hear in the media. So you might have heard 9% at one point being mentioned in terms of the inflation rate. I'm using a measure of inflation that has two pieces to it. One is it's a different basket of goods and services that the Fed likes to use. And then I've stripped out food and energy, and that's because those tend to be very volatile and transitory. So that 9% number was largely driven by gas prices, but we all knew it was going to come down really fast because gas prices will not keep growing at the same rate forever. They always come back down. Or they don't even need to come back down. They're not going to keep, if they doubled over a 6-month period, they're not going to double again every 6 months for the next 5 years. That never works that way. So this is a better measure, we feel, economists feel, of underlying inflation, the true inflationary pressures in the economy. All right, so that's the data. The question is, how do we understand these data? What is the reason that we had this faster recovery in the wake of the COVID recession? To answer that, I'm going to start talking a little bit about a little theory about what we mean by monetary and fiscal policy and how those work. So monetary policy is a very limited, narrow thing. It's basically the Federal Reserve varies interest rates. They try to move them, they just move them up and down. Fiscal policy is hugely complicated, a lot of different things going on, but we're going to reduce it down to a very simple thing. Congress varies spending and taxes. There's lots of complexity involved underneath that, but That's what I'm going to try to reduce it down to that because I'm mainly interested in that the impact on inflation and unemployment. Now, these two policies actually have very similar effects on the economy. An interest rate cut by the Fed or a tax cut by Congress or extra spending by Congress gives rise to more spending in the economy. When there's more spending, businesses have more demand for their goods and services. They're going to need to hire more workers. They're going to have to produce more output. They're going to raise prices. So suddenly we see monetary and fiscal policy, if I cut interest rates or if I cut taxes, increase spending, I'm going to be pushing, as a policymaker, I'm going to push output, employment, and inflation in the same direction. Unemployment will go in the opposite direction. So this is our tool. If we want to have a recovery that's fast in terms of unemployment, we have to cut interest rates or we have to have a tax cut or increase spending by Congress. In that way, we'll have more unemployment. But at the same time, that's going to put upward pressure on prices. Those always go together, basically, in terms of the policy tools that are available to in launch. So how does monetary policy work in the U.S.? Well, the Constitution told Congress to do it. And Congress, we're not talking about politics here, but it's a little bit of a theme of Congress. They asked someone else to do it for them. And so here they asked the Federal Open Market Committee to do it. And that's who makes monetary policy. And it's basically a branch of the Central Bank of the U.S., the Federal Reserve. And so the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, can vary interest rates in response to shocks like the 2007, 2009 financial crisis that gave rise to the Great Recession or COVID. But they're not allowed to do whatever they want with monetary policy. They are charged with meeting two goals. And this is taken very seriously at the Fed. They're not sitting around just making monetary policies. They're very aware when they meet and talk about monetary policy that they're not elected officials. They are appointed officials. They are supposed to do what Congress asked them to do. What does Congress ask them to do? They promote price stability and promote maximum employment. But it's a little vague. So the first goal has been translated into this 2% target that I mentioned earlier. Deflation, negative inflation has lots of bad consequences. We can talk about that if you want. And the committee is very aware of that, very worried about that. On the other hand, you don't want high inflation, as we've seen. People don't like high inflation. 2% is viewed as balancing these out as best as we can. So that's on the inflation front. Maximum employment is let's try to keep unemployment as low as we can. That's basically the way the committee thinks. But these two goals, promoting price stability and promoting maximum employment, whenever you have two goals in life, general life lesson, there is a potential for tension between those two goals. And if you start adding more and more goals, there's more tension in life. And so here we have two goals, and they can be opposed to one another. Cutting interest rates, that helps reduce unemployment. That's a good thing. But an interest rate cut, can also, by boosting demand, will lead businesses to charge higher prices. That will be inflationary. And so we have a tension. By trying to reduce unemployment, you can have higher inflation. And that tension is what lies at the heart of policymaking. So this raises a big question for the Fed. And in the two recoveries, they answer this question in very different ways. Should the Fed be willing to make policy choices that might give rise to inflation being temporarily above 2%? There's no difference about where they want inflation to go in the long run. They want inflation to be at 2% in the long run. So that's agreed upon, both after COVID and after the Great Recession. The question is, how do you get there? You get there from below, or you get there from above? And in the post-2009 recovery, the Fed was determined to only get back to 2% from below. I said that wrong. After the Great Recession, the Fed was determined to get there by only getting there from below. So And after COVID, after the post 2020 recovery, the answer was we're going to be willing to let inflation run above target for a while. We'll come back to target from above. This difference in the Fed's approach, it's thinking about inflation, is key to understanding why we had very different kinds of recovery after COVID and after the Great Recession. Okay, so that is a very high level monetary fiscal policy. If you find this exciting and interesting, I encourage you to take lots more economics courses. You can learn a lot more about it. But that's basically what I'm going to say now. What I'm going to do now is turn to the actual choices that were made about policy, first post 2009, and then after COVID. But this question about what the objectives of policy are, especially on the monetary policy front, is critical in understanding things. Here, in the first recovery, the Fed wanted to come back from below, and after the second recovery, the fast recovery, was willing to come to 2%. That difference in approach is critical. So let me talk about macro policy in the post 2009 recovery. And I think one thing to say about this is, I think one of the challenges that was mistakes that was made in after 2009 is everyone looked at what was being done and said, "Wow, this is unprecedented. This is amazing what we're doing. It's got to be, But that's the wrong way to judge things. You shouldn't be judging things on how much time you're spending on the office. You should be judging things in terms of what you're producing. And on the outcome side, things were not going well. And the problem was that everyone's saying, "Oh, we've done so much," that it's both fiscal policymakers and monetary policy. Let me give you some detail. So, in the immediate response to the 2007 recession, the 2007-2009 recession, in 2008, President Bush, George W. Bush, the Republican, sponsored fiscal stimulus. And in early 2009, after his election, President Obama also did this. So during the recession, I think fiscal policy attempted to be stimulative. During the course of the recovery, fiscal policy was a major drag on the recovery. Congress was cutting spending as much as it could. So you can see this, and by looking at federal spending relative to GDP, this is not, I don't know why I've included all this information, but this part here is the Great Recession. And you see federal spending goes up relative to GDP, both under Bush and Obama. And then afterwards, you see this drag, meaning that federal spending is going down relative to GDP during the recovery. And that's the sense in which the fiscal side of the government is basically saying, let's put the brakes on things. Let's not spend as much. And that was, it is what it is. That's what was going on in Washington at that time. It's also what was going on in London, United Kingdom. There are many other countries are having a similar kind of response to conditions. All right, they say this here. And in the U.S., we tend to focus on our own polarization, which is pretty pointed. And it's absolutely true that politics here mattered in terms of the fiscal policy decisions that were being made here in the U.S. But really, this was true around the world. And when I was a Fed policymaker from 2009 to 2015, the first question I would often get is, isn't the deficit too big? Isn't the debt too large? From voters, this is something that was very large in their mind. And that concern among voters and their representatives translated into fiscal policy drag in many countries, not just the United States. A lot of the forces that we see at play here in this country are operational in many of them. So this is what the voters were worried about. And again, this at the end is the Great Recession, not the COVID recession. And you can see the federal debt shot up relative to GDP. This is about 2/3 of a GDP. That's how much debt the government owes at the beginning of the Great Recession. By the end, it owes close to 90% of GDP. So it goes up a lot. And the voters look at that, and their representatives look at that and say, whoa, something's got to give. This is a real problem. And so they vote for restrictive policy. Now, what about monetary policy? So I've told you fiscal policy is restrictive. I don't think that I think is relatively controversial. On the monetary policy front, it's a little more complicated and a little more subtle because it looks like it's very stimulative. The Fed cuts interest rates to about as low as they can go in December 2008, and it keeps that there for 7 years until I left. Let me spread a reason. But they ended up keeping that short-term rate at near zero for 7 years until the unemployment rate reached 5%. This sounds very stimulative, but it doesn't really matter in monetary policy what you end up doing. All that matters is what people expect you to do. Because current spending is not affected by what you end up doing. It's expected by what people think interest rates are going to do in the future, and is how they decide. Should I spend a lot today? Well, I'll spend a lot if I think interest rates are going to be low in the future. I think they're going to be high. I'm going to wait to get those high interest rates. The drag is that the Fed and markets expected rate hikes to begin when the unemployment rate was very high and inflation was very low. So if you go back to November 2009, the very beginning of the recovery, the FOMC expected their staff, more correctly, expected the initial rate hike to take place 2.5 years later. But the time doesn't matter. They expected interest rate to increase to begin when the unemployment rate was 8%. We talked about all the human misery that's associated with that. They expected rate hikes to begin when unemployment rate was 8%, and inflation was still well below the 2% target at 1%. That's a staff. You might think, oh, staff doesn't know what they're doing. Actually, policymakers thought they would be even more restrictive. Staff was actually trying to be optimistic about how policy would work. Why was that? Well, we can see actually from the goals that policymakers wrote down their goals for inflation, what they were aiming for, and they actually wanted to keep inflation from ever going above 2%. If you look at all the forecast, the projections for where they wanted inflation to be, they never wanted it to go above 2. And those policymakers, we saw from the picture of inflation earlier, their desires for what should happen with inflation were. All right, so now what happened in the COVID recovery? I mean, it's night and day. Monetary and fiscal policy have both been much more supportive of economic activity in the COVID recovery. There were 3 large fiscal interventions. They're all considerably larger. I think they're all twice as large as the 2009 stimulus was passed under President Obama. March of 2020 and December 2020, both under President Trump's leadership, and then under President Biden's leadership in March of 2021. All these heavy reliance on direct transfers, so people got money directly into their bank accounts. UI benefit extensions, meaning people who were unemployed had much longer access to benefits. Fiscal policy supported a fast recovery. Much different from the monetary policy. The Fed cut interest rates to 0, but that's not the important thing. They consistently communicated that they were going to stay the course. They were going to keep rates low for a long time, meaning until conditions got much better. So in September of 2020, for example, and again in September 21, the Fed projected its first rate hike would not take place until the unemployment rate was below 4 and inflation was above 2. Now, I want you to try to remember back to like 3 slides ago when I was talking about how the Fed thought about this in the Great Recession, when they said the first rate hike would take place when the unemployment rate was above 8%. It's a very different Fed. They are willing to let unemployment get low before they start raising rates. Why? Because they're willing to tolerate inflation. Now, where does this come from? Well, throughout 2019, before COVID, the Fed engaged in a serious reconsideration of its approach to inflation. It did something that was pretty unheard of for the Fed to do. It actually went out and talked to ordinary people about their experiences in the labor market. This was hugely informative for them. And it was, they learned that low unemployment had enormous benefits for wide ranges of the workforce by giving them access to employment they would not otherwise have. as a result, the Fed announced in August of 2020, and this was during COVID, but it really was unrelated to COVID. It was fueled by their reconsideration of their approach to inflation in 2019. That it would be comfortable with inflation being temporarily above 2% immediately after recession. So that's in August of 2020. Eventually, the Fed didn't raise rates until March of 2022, when inflation was actually near 5%. So it waited a very long time in terms of inflation space in terms of rate. So here's the inflation rate back again, and the Fed raises rates for the first time after the Great Recession. Here, inflation is well below 2% still. It's very, I don't understand what they're doing. But, I was on the committee at that point and I was complaining about it, but, you're one person. And then after COVID, you'll see that the first rate hike takes place around here. And that is when inflation, as I said, is really over 5%. So a very different kind of Fed in terms of what they're willing to tolerate on the inflation. Okay. So at this point, you should be thinking, what's a little bit of inflation? We can get unemployment down fast. That's a great thing. We get rid of all this human misery on the jobs front, in terms of how much the damage is being caused, the social harm has been caused by high unemployment for long periods of time. So, okay, let's do the second approach. Let's be aggressive when we have recession. And if I could stop here and say, yeah, that's what I want you to take away, but that's a little dishonest because it's actually a little too small. So what I've communicated to you is that it seems like the U.S. can get much faster recoveries if Congress is willing to spend more and tax less, when I say tax less, what I really mean is they hand out more money, so they're transferring more. And importantly, the Fed is willing to tolerate temporarily above target inflation. So those two pieces can get us faster recoveries, but there's still an issue question. Inflation is still above 2%, and the Fed has to get inflation back down. That's their target, that's their goal, and all the power of monetary policy, and this is too technical for me to get into, but all the power is that people actually believe that inflation will come back down to 2. As soon as people start to doubt whether it's going to be a 2, could be a 3, or could be a 4, everything the Fed does can be disappeared. It vanishes. It goes into prices as opposed to quantities. So we have to make sure that anchor stays in people's minds. So we have this question: will we have a recession in the next couple of years? And the second question is, will this explosion of U.S. government debt that we've seen post-COVID, will it cause borrowing costs for the U.S. government to rise to unusual levels? So far, so good. Okay, so far, it looks like we're not going to have a recession. We're going to be able to bring down inflation back down to 2% without causing a big recession. And the explosion in government debt that we've seen does not seem to be. We've definitely seen borrowing costs go up, and we can talk a little bit about that if you want, but they're not at unusual levels. They're basically returned to pre-Great Recession levels. It's not. We're not running into some kind of danger zone on this front at all. But nonetheless, I would say we want to see this experiment play out still for another couple of years. And if we do come back down to 2%, with unemployment never going above 4, never going above 4.5%, I think then we can say, and without some kind of major debt crisis, we can say that yes, we've learned the lesson, and the lesson is: don't be cautious, be aggressive, spend and cut interest rates, and stay the course with these policy tools, and we can have much faster and durable recovery. That's all I have to say. Look forward to your questions. Thanks.
While the JT is standing there with the mic, I thought I would, pull rank slightly and ask you the first question, if I may. Right, as a sort of follow-up to what you said about, rising, borrowing costs. Um, Thanks to the rising interest rate environment, it seems that, this year the U.S. government's debt servicing is going to be about $200 billion more than it was last year. And I believe, even in a rare occurrence, Chairman Powell has also, indirectly commented on it. So do you think that this rising debt servicing cost is going to apply a, de facto and a fiscal constraint on the U.S. government's ability to handle the next recession? I mean,
I think it's a great question, but I think really it's that the Fed has said for a long time, and many economists have said for a long time, that there needs to be a plan to deal with the level of the deficit and the level of the debt in the United States. It's not something we have to deal with immediately, I don't think, but there has to be a plan in place, I think, to deal with it over the longer term. And I'm not sure what remarks of Powell you're referring to in particular, but in general, what Fed chairs said is, look, monetary policy and fiscal policy can be much more effective in recessions. In steady state, in good times, we have a lower level. And that's something I think for Congress to continue to work on. But they have many plans.
So I guess my question basically has to do with the baby plan kind of how that relates to like the private credit space. So private credit obviously is super attractive, both lenders and borrowers in different regions, and it's kind of been said that it really helped us kind of kick out of the recession. So, both have been expected to increase over the year. So given the kind of current market rates that we're seeing right now, if they kind of remain that high for a while, as they expect it to get inflation back down to 2%, do you see or do you think that there can be a decrease in demand in private credit space on the borrower side that are going to ultimately make the recessionary pressures a little bit greater?
Everything about high interest rates, the reason the Fed has high interest rates is to introduce drag in the economy. Now, it sounds like they're being mean or something, but that's in order to get prices down, you have to have less demand for goods and services. One way to do that is restrain credit through private credit, but just generally. And that is what the Fed is trying to achieve. Why are they doing that? As I said, it's trying to bring inflation down. What has been extraordinarily heartening over the past year in particular is that we've seen a relatively market decline in inflation without high unemployment. So unemployment has remained, sub 4%, and we've still seen this decline in inflation. Will that continue? Will we still? I should back up and say this has been the story the Fed has told really from the beginning of the inflation experience. The inflation has been caused by supply chain disruptions, the war in Ukraine, COVID effects. They're a little vague about what it is exactly, but whatever it is, it's going on its own without having to have a recession. The last year has been very good for that story. Will that continue to be true? I think there's uncertainty about it, but I'm cautiously optimistic. That's the way I would describe it. But it's absolutely fundamental. There's definitely a risk, I think, of a recession being necessary to bring down inflation. And once that happens, I think the lesson I want to take away from this experience might be very different, because then people are going to be saying the only way the aggressive policy brings about the seed of a new recession, and maybe we don't want that.
Since the first recession was, I call it more of a man-made caused by internal problems, whereas the second one kind of came out of nowhere. It was just a random thing that we weren't being prepared for.
You obviously went to both of these. I don't remember the first one really, but were you surprised to see how quickly a more unexpected one was than the one that was kind of predicted by some, and even there were whispers about things that could happen, despite a long recovery from the first one, and a short recovery.
Well, I was surprised. I was a policymaker during the recovery from the first recession. You often ask me, "What's your big standard kind of question you get if you have those kinds of jobs?" One is what keeps you awake at night, and the other is what's your biggest surprise. And the biggest surprise when I was Fed president was how long the recovery took. I thought we would get back to desirable level of employment much more rapidly. On the COVID recovery, I've been surprised. I was definitely surprised by how fast unemployment came down, but not so much. It seemed like the reduction in activity, as you suggested, was largely of our own making, and we could undo it. What was surprising to me is how high inflation has remained for as long as it has. So, but there are surprises associated with both. I guess the story I'm telling, though, is that the source of the shock is not the key thing. The source of what we lived through in terms of the recoveries in particular, is dictated by the policy response as much as anything. Had we had an aggressive policy response in the first recession, we had been willing to let inflation go above 2%, we would have had unemployment come down much faster. Would it have come down within a year and a half, like we did after COVID? Probably. Or would it have come down faster than 8 years? Absolutely. So that's really the story I want to tell. Is you're right to say, look, these recessions came from different sources. But I think ultimately, in terms of the impact on inflation and unemployment, it's really about the policy response.
I think the cause of the recessions are very, very different, and that has also led to how long it took to recover. The first recession was due to the collapse of the housing industry and the banking industry, the financial sector, which the Fed was giving out loans to banks like crazy and doing all kinds of other things which it never ever did in history. And so it wasn't only thinking about inflation and unemployment. And it took a long time for that to all recover. And in the second recession, people got sick, but because of the internet and remote learning and remote work conditions, people were able to go back to work right away, almost literally from home rather than from the office. And so the conditions are very, very different in both recessions. A recession is not a recession, I guess. So the recoveries could be very different because of that.
I'll say a couple of things about that. So I think the Fed's vision in the wake of the global financial crisis from 2007 to 2009 was, let's save the banking sector. And if we save the banking sector, then we're going to recover. So that was their vision. As long as the banking sector was, as you suggest, was an enormous challenge in the 2008, 2009 time frame. By 2010, at least in the among policymakers, the feeling was mission accomplished with the banking sector. The household sector, huge problems. And the challenge was the household sector's slowness to recover fueled into the slowness to recover of the economy. That is a choice. That is a choice for us to make. If we give them more money, they will spend more. And that's what we did in COVID. We gave people a lot more money to spend. I mean, we did unprecedented amount of intervention in 2009. Everything we did in 2009, we doubled and tripled and more in. So I think they. As I was answering the previous question, would we have gotten back to unemployment rates of 4.5% within a year and a half? I don't want to suggest that. But what I suggest is the differences in these recoveries are shaped in no little part by the fact that, one, we just said, let's save the banking sector and the households can take care of themselves. What we said in 2009 and thereafter, meeting in Fed and Congress. And in after 2020, we did not have that happen. And so that is huge positive in terms of this.
My name is Sadia. First of all, I want to say thank you for being here and showing great times. And I'm actually with the lost community who came here to just see what's all about. I guess my question is the you know the social aspect of it. So I know you gave a lot of this in the answer, right? Like yes, we go further and not that elections that we need to at the same time. So what if that doesn't happen? What if things change this? What does the country what are we doing to
Yeah, these are important questions. These are difficult questions. As I suggested, one of the answers to an earlier question, by raising interest rates as much as the Fed has, and they've raised interest rates by over 5 percentage points in a year and a half. They are attempting to slow down the economy, and that means people are getting jobs. But the reason to do that is we're paying that price in order to try to bring down inflation. So we've got these two choices. We've got the life trade-offs, and that is one trade-off we had to face. I usually try to avoid saying the Fed. One of your mandates, among the two mandates I mentioned, you're supposed to be completely politically neutral, not to say anything political at all, and talk about politics. So I've liked that for a long time, but I try to carry that on. Having said that, I verge a little bit into politics, which is, I think that one of the challenges that we faced here in the United States in terms of the fiscal response during the Great Recession and the recovery was that the presidency was held by, part of that time, the presidency was in the hands of one party, and the Congress is in the hands of another party. And that created tensions in terms of what should be done. When we got to 2020, having a Republican president, and sort of counterintuitive, but having a Republican president led to kudos and stimulus. If we'd had a Democratic president in office, I think Congress might not have been as willing to go along with the stimulus. So it's a little counterintuitive about how it worked. And it's obviously not going to tell anyone how to vote. It's just a description of how I see how the fiscal policy. Final caveat on it, I am not an expert in politics, and I know very little about it. What I know on the technical side of it, especially on the economic.
I can't guarantee it real quick. My question is regarding inflation and the inherent limits of the Fed's power, specifically related to the private sector. Quick background: I spent 15 years in charge of communications at a Fortune 250 company. We reported earnings 4 times a year. 4 of the magic words on Wall Street: pricing power and profit. So you haven't touched on tonight the role in inflation of the private sector. You listen to the earnings calls that have been going on for the last year or two. The cheers are usually because of the pricing power. So you can address kind of the pricing power and the inability, except if you go back perhaps to Richard Nixon and the potential for price control. Limits of the Fed in trying to work with the private sector and the inherent conflict between the public good and the private sector.
Yeah, so this is another talk. If you like me back, I can do that talk. I have another talk on who's winning from inflation, who's not. I can give you let's just stop talking. But it's impossible for economists to stop talking, as you know. Let me see if I can pull this up here. So this is, I think, what one way to see what you're talking about. If we look at what's happening to real wages, so this is how much people are being paid per hour, but net of inflation. It's very important to correct for inflation. You'll hear people say, even the chairman of the Fed said, oh, labor market's tight because wages are going up so fast. Those are all nominal in terms of dollars. It's not taking into account what those dollars buy, which is what we care about. We don't care about what we get paid. We care about what we can buy with those dollars. And what we see is actually since the end of the COVID recession, we've seen a steady decline in how much our wages are bringing home. Because who is winning? And it's the profit side that's winning on that. The Fed has no way to negotiate a better split for workers. Their vision is only that if they reduce demand, then the pricing power will go down. And that will lead then to lower inflation. They don't have any way to say, workers should get more. They can't make that happen. The only way they can manifest lower inflation for overall, which is their mandate, is to try to reduce the pricing power of firms, and that pricing power they view it as being intrinsically linked to demand. All of this is really grounded in the events. I suspect you remember, and I certainly do, of the early 80s, where the Fed was successful in bringing down inflation, and the way they brought down inflation was by raising rates a lot, 5 percentage points in the space of I'm going to forget, but a very short period. And so that lesson is what fuels all of their interventions in this. But yeah, I think it's, if you look at where the source of inflation come from, it's not from workers demanding too many wages, which you will hear from too many people. It's from the fact that you suggest that firms have a lot of pricing. Thank you very much for your question.
All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being here this evening. Thank you very much, Professor Korzakota, for your insights. And I wish we could stay longer because I'm sure there were a few more questions, but perhaps we'll have you back again to answer those. Thank you again.